So, Ralph, thank you for taking the time to join me today and discuss this. I really appreciate it. For those of you who may not know Ralph Smith, he works with FedSmith, writes lots of articles for the site. Also, he has been involved in the Federal Labor and Employee Relations Program since 1973. He's also worked for several agencies in Washington, D.C., including the FLRA and OPM. And he also worked for NASA in Huntsville, Alabama, as the LER officer and deputy personnel officer there. So, Ralph, everybody's talking about DOGE and telework. And after the election, there's all this talk about cuts and how it's going to impact the federal workforce. And I'm sure a lot of FedSmith readers and other federal employees are concerned about what's this going to mean for me. It really culminated this week when President-elect Trump said that he intends to fire federal employees who refuse to return to work in their agency offices. And you wrote an article about this that's been very widely read. And by the way, for anyone watching, I'll make sure I include a link in the comments or in the description so you can check out that article. It's got a lot of good information in it. Combating that, federal employee unions have been working to secure collective bargaining agreements with their agencies that allow for telework, despite what the incoming Trump administration and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency that's being chaired by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, has said they want to do with telework. So how would this work in practice? What should federal employees know? Can the president or the incoming Congress just override these collective bargaining agreements? Should federal employees be worried about losing their jobs next year?
Okay, well, thank you for having me here, Ian. I appreciate it. And we appreciate everybody who's taking the time to look at this, to learn more about DOGE and specifically about the Show Up Act. It's a good question, and we've been through some of this before. When President Carter lost the election and Ronald Reagan came in, there were a lot of people upset about what was going to happen with their job as a federal employee. It's probably even, not probably, it is more direct now because we've got the DOGE Acts, we've got comments from President Trump, and as you said, most recently said that if employees don't come back to work, they're going to be dismissed. Now that's pretty specific, and that's from the president-elect, so we can assume he means it. Now, part of what I think they're trying to accomplish is a lot of people have said, if I am forced to go back to work in an office, I'm going to resign. And according to the people who are heading DOGE, that is Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, they think that this is a good way to get a number of federal employees to resign without having to go through the process of firing them, the appeals processes, the EEO complaints, whatever else may come up when they go to implement it. As to whether or not the president can do it or Congress can do it, that remains to be seen. Congress clearly could. Now, if they pass the Show Up Act, which is part of the DOGE Acts, it says in there that federal agencies will return to their December 31st, 2019 benchmark pre-pandemic telework levels within 30 days. In other words, within 30 days, if you read this one way, you will not be working at home unless the agency says you have to work at home for some reason. So in effect, it looks like it's telling employees you have to go back to work. On the other hand, as you've intimated, Ian, federal unions, in some cases, we know the Social Security Administration, have negotiated a contract that gives them the right to continue their telework policy until after the Trump administration is over, 5 years from now. So what's going to happen? That remains to be seen. The previous cases, and many of these cases happened during the first Trump administration, and something similar happened. That was in a series of executive orders. And basically what the Trump administration was trying to do was to restrict the activities of federal employees working on behalf of unions. A number of different restrictions went into place, for example, requiring unions to pay rent for office space. And when these executive orders came out, unions filed unfair labor practices. It went to the FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Some of them went into court. And basically, what these cases have held is that while the president and Congress can make these changes and federal employees and agencies have to follow them, but they still have to bargain at a minimum the impact and implementation of it. So that's probably likely to happen again this time. They have to bargain at least the impact and implementation. I'm sure unions are going to argue they can't do this because they've already agreed, they being the management of Social Security or other agencies, that gives us the right to continue telework through the Trump administration, in effect. We don't know how that will happen. My guess is, at a minimum, what will happen, the president could require all employees who are not in a bargaining unit to go back to work in an office. So specifically, supervisors, managers, and various other employees who aren't in a union will have to go back to work. Those in the bargaining unit perhaps will stay in telework longer. Once those supervisors come back to work, if they're not already working in an office, I think employees are going to be pressured to get back to work in the office. If they don't, they might see it as harming their career. And they're probably right. If the supervisor thinks you're not doing as good a job as you would if you're coming to the work in the office, probably you're going to have to go back to work. How this plays out before the FLRA and courts remains to be seen. I suspect there's going to be plenty of litigation.
Okay. So you think it probably would eventually happen, but I guess, is it fair to say the collective bargaining agreements and the things that the unions have been working on to put in place before the Trump administration comes in is just kind of slows it down? It's a roadblock, for lack of a better description.
I think that's correct. I think a lot of people will be going back to work even if they don't want to. Now, as a practical matter, if I were a federal employee and I really didn't want to go back to work in an office and I'm eligible to retire, that's a great time to pick to retire. I mean, you're still going to get your health benefits paid up to 70% typically by the government. You're going to get your annuity. Now, it may take OPM a while to process it, especially if tens of thousands of people suddenly apply for retirement. They hadn't expected it, but you will get paid. You will be able to retire. You won't lose any benefits at all. On the other hand, if you're, say, 35, 45 years old and a relatively new federal employee, new being, say, under 20 years, then retirement isn't an option. You can quit, obviously, and if you want to go back to work in an office, that's probably, even if you don't want to, that's probably a good idea because you want to save your job, I would imagine, because of the benefits. Getting an income is always a nice thing, and most of us would need that. So I think some federal employees are going to be faced with some tough decisions they have to make. Do I go back to work even if I don't want to and work in an office in downtown DC or Atlanta, or wherever you happen to be? So that's the reality that employees are going to be facing. Now, if a federal agency directs employees to come back, the general rule is if you're given a direct order by the agency, you don't have an option of not obeying it. You have to follow that order. Now, if you don't like it, follow the order. You can still file a grievance. And for a bargaining unit employee, that probably means filing a grievance or the negotiated grievance procedure. You might still have to go to work in the office, but if you get an arbitrator's decision or a decision that comes through the FLRA that you can continue telework, then you go back to work at home at that time. But disobeying an order isn't a good option because if the agency decides to fire a person for not obeying the order, there's plenty of case law that says they've got the right to do that. So you're going to have to think through it. What is the impact going to be on your income, your family, if you lose your job?
Okay. You mentioned retirements. I know when we've covered some of this before, rifts come up, like when DOGE was talking about their plans and how they want to reduce the size of the federal workforce. I wrote an article about this last month, I guess. And it sounded to me like RIFs were what was the impact was going to be. Do you see that coming into play here, or being a tool that agencies use to make reductions or force people out?
Yeah, it is a tool, and I suspect in some agencies, once DOGE gets into gear, starts functioning, and looks specifically at various agencies, and they want to reduce the workforce in those agencies, RIF is an option. Reduction in force is the obvious way to do it. Frankly, that's a miserable process to have to go through. It's miserable if you in the personnel office or human resources office. It's also miserable, of course, for the employees because it takes a long time. It disrupts jobs, it disrupts the work of the agency, and people end up losing their jobs. And there's going to be grievances, complaints, probably unfair labor practice charges, et cetera, that are filed. But that's the way an agency will typically go about making a reduction in the size of its workforce if it has to do so. Nobody wants to go through that. And I think part of the reason or part of the rationale of telling people in advance, I'm going to direct people to go back to work, and if they don't show up, they're going to be dismissed. That's a way to get the workforce down to a smaller size if that's the president's goal, the president-elect's goal. And he's pretty much said that that is his goal. If President Trump hasn't said it, then certainly Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have said it. And I think they're serious. I think they're going to try to move out with it.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that's the goal. They're optimistic about making the cuts. I know we've talked about it before. I mean, they're optimistic. They're determined. They're hiring a bunch of people to work as volunteers. The Wall Street Journal had an article that people are lining up to work there, even though they're not going to be getting paid. So there's certainly some enthusiasm there. I don't know, though. It's not easy to make cuts to regulation spending. I mean, the government is by design a big bureaucracy it's intended to move slowly. So we'll see. I don't know how successful they'll be in enacting some of this. So in that respect, I think it's probably too early to be panicking, but it's wise to gather information and be prepared, which seems to be what you're suggesting.
It is. And I've been through this before. When President Carter lost the election to President Reagan, a man by the name of Don Devine came into work as head of the Office of Personnel Management. And there were a lot of articles about basically what a terrible person he was, how hard it was going to be for federal employees. And there were a number of discussions. In fact, President Reagan set up something called the Grace Commission to try and reduce government expenses, government spending, very similar to the DOGE Commission that's just been set up. Some expenses were reduced, some programs were cut. The reality is, by the time President Reagan had finished his 2 terms in office, government spending went up about 4.5%.
And deficit commission, remember that? I'm under the Obama administration, same thing. Not much really came out of that.
Right. It's difficult to get these programs passed, and a president can issue an executive order. That order can be challenged. Now, Congress, it's more effective. For example, President Carter got the Civil Service Reform Act passed. Once something becomes a law, it's more difficult to overturn it. And we know that Congress could pass a law. They could pass a law if they wanted to, outlawing federal employees having unions to represent them. I'm not predicting or saying that is going to happen or should happen. Congress could do it. The president couldn't issue an executive order banning unions when you've got a law that says they have a right to exist in the government and to do certain things as enunciated by the CSRA. So it's difficult to get something through Congress, and a number of Republicans have already said, I'm not going to vote for some Trump nominees, as an example. Not an overwhelming majority in Congress in the Republican Party. So all it takes is a few senators, for example, or a few representatives not to support a proposal, and that would kill the bill. we don't know what's going to happen. That will have to be determined through the debate that occurs in Congress and pay attention. The other thing that happens if you're a federal employee, I was concerned when some of these started going into effect in 80, 81, and I decided make the most of it, enjoy it. A lot's changing, take advantage of it. And I did. I worked hard. I supported the administration as the Civil Service Commission or Office of Personnel Management directed. And I actually enjoyed it. I got to travel around the country, went from a GS-9 to a GS-14 in a relatively short period. And it didn't turn out to be such a bad thing. So I think a lot of federal employees may find themselves in a more desirable position than they might expect.
Good advice. That's probably a good positive note to end on. I know a lot of people are frustrated, worried, scared, and so I appreciate you taking the time to talk through some of it and provide some information. We'll continue to update our readers with new information as it comes up. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of it because anytime you got a new administration coming in, there's always going to be changes. We will keep everyone informed, and thank you again for taking the time today. I appreciate it.
Certainly. Thank everybody for watching. If you have questions, please feel free to send us a note and keep up with the articles on FedSmith. We will be covering it in numerous articles as events unfold, expected or unexpected.